Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you a review today of a very interesting little lens, particularly if you're on a tight budget and are an APS-C mirrorless shooter, shooting either a Sony or a Fuji mirrorless body, or also if you are a micro four thirds shooter. This lens is the Pergear 25mm F1.8. Now, Pergear is a company that I've been familiar with for some time as a distributor of other products and as a retailer, but not as a lens manufacturer. And so this is kind of a new arena for them. But what they have created is an incredibly cheap. This lens retails for 68 bucks. And so if you're on a tight budget and you're looking to experiment with a different focal length, maybe to experiment with a manual focus lens, this is an intriguing lens on a lot of levels. It's also a pretty fantastic alternative to some vintage lenses where this kind of focal length is somewhat hard to find in vintage or legacy lenses, 25 millimeters. And also, I don't find that some of those lenses are as good as what, say, the standard or short telephoto lenses are. And so anyway, it's definitely worth a look at. Today we're going to jump in and take a closer look at the build, the optical performance, and a general consensus, give you kind of a verdict on the lens and whether or not you should consider it. So first of all, we're going to jump in and let's take a closer look at this little tiny optic in terms of its build and its design here. So kind of the standout feature that I do want to quickly note while it's facing you here is that it has a really nice aperture here, moves incredibly smoothly, but it has a really high aperture blade count of 12 blades, which allows it to, number one, have a surprisingly interesting sunburst effect, sun stars you can see here, but also, of course, allows it to retain a really circular aperture shape when stopped down, which is useful for bokeh. Of course, it'd be even more useful if this was also combined with a longer focal length and larger maximum aperture, where you actually might create bokeh with the lens stopped down. But, you know, that's another aside. You can see up front it is a very small 43 millimeter front filter thread, and you can also see that the barrel does extend out a little bit during focusing. You have a kind of a unique, very small but kind of a knurled focus ring up near the front, right at the very front of the lens, and you can see that they've chosen to go with kind of a bright chrome look that, you know, is going to be a little bit eye-catching. It's also, you know, arguably a little bit cheap looking, which of course is appropriate considering this is a lens that retails for $68. It is not an expensive lens. But truly a tiny little lens. It is only 38 millimeters in its overall length, 55 millimeters at its widest in diameter, and so it is tiny. It weighs in at 195 grams. And that is most due to the fact because this is actually a surprisingly nice build quality here. Everything is all in metal, you know, metal lens mount. The materials actually feel really nice. And so, you know, an interesting combination of cheapness, but also a very nice build. Optical formula is incredibly simple. This is only 5 elements in 3 groups, and that's not always a bad thing. And so your aperture ring here is declicked, and so it moves smoothly, and you can rack all the way from f1.8 through to f16. So as you can see, while it is manual everything, which means there is no electronics, there's no communication to the camera, at the same time you can still get things like focus peaking and even in-body image stabilization if your camera supports it. You will want to manually put in the focal length itself, however, to make sure that the camera is giving you the appropriate amount of stabilization. But you know, fortunately, it's less of a limiting principle here as it used to be on, say, DSLRs. At the same time, however, you know, there are some limitations that come with that. But at 68 bucks, I don't think that I expected anything different. Now, what's interesting, however, is when we take a closer look at the image quality. As we saw, it's got a surprisingly good build for the money. It also has a fairly decent optical performance for the money. So let's take a look at that. Starting off, we'll take a look at distortion and vignette. You can see that distortion, there is a very mild amount of barrel distortion. Not bad here, however, and even just doing a manual correction, which is probably what you're going to end up with. I would be surprised if we ever see an actual profile. You see that it corrects fairly easily, and I'll show you the settings there. So I use just a +4 for correction there, so kind of a mild amount. Now, as far as the vignette, I've got a lot dialed in here, about 2/3 dialed in, and then the midpoint moved all the way over. The one a minor thing is that there is an extra amount of vignette in the extreme corner, and so you can pull that on up to 100%. What you're going to find is that that last little bit, it's just quite dark in the extreme corners, and so the vignette doesn't correct perfectly. So looking at a real world setting where everything is basically almost monochromatic, you can see that the vignette is pretty obvious in that situation. And you can see that my correction worked quite well. What you can also see is there's just the tiniest bit of vignette in the corners, probably not enough to be a real factor there. So here's a look at the test chart F1.8. And so we can see that there's actually a fair bit of contrast and sharpness in the center of the frame. You can see it looks pretty good here. You can also see, however, that the zone starts to drop off a little bit even by the left side of the bill. It's not as strong there. As we move off in this direction, you can see a fairly marked difference from the left corner to the right bottom corner. And then you can see, once again, that we're getting pretty soft towards the extreme corner there, and contrast is basically completely shot. Now, stopping down to F2.8 shows that we've got a pretty strong improvement throughout a lot of the frame. You can see that there's a notable difference here to here. You can also see, looking down towards the corner, that if you look no further than about here, it's a significant improvement, both in the vignette but also the contrast. The corner is still quite soft, however. By F4, we're seeing a very strong amount of sharpness right off until towards the very corner. And right in those very corners, there's still softness. If you exclude that portion, everything else is looking really crisp at this point. Now finally, by F5.6, you can see that our sharpness is pretty much all the way through this bill. It's just down at the very, very, very corner that contrast is being lost a little bit. But at this point, kind of a landscape aperture, we've definitely got acceptable resolution. So this represents our minimum focus distance here and our magnification, and so not a particularly high, but still good enough to be useful in some situations. And we can see, at least in the center of the frame, that there is a pretty decent amount of sharpness and contrast. It's certainly a usable end result. Now, for those wondering about putting it on full frame, this shows you how much of the full frame image circle is covered. And so it's definitely, it's not covering any additional part of the image circle. When I cropped this down, in fact, I found that I didn't gain anything compared to just shooting it in APS-C mode. This shows the same shot in APS-C mode. And so I will point out, quite good resolution here. It looks nice and crisp, great details. You can see right in that very, very corner, as we saw, that resolution disappears in the very corner, but moving out just a tiny bit, you can see very, very strong resolution. You can see it lost right there at the edge of the frame again, but quite good in the middle. There's also a fairly interesting color signature to this lens. It produces, I think, unique and interesting images. Now, in terms of the bokeh, this is not a super high contrast lens, wide open, and so it makes for, again, as I said, kind of an interesting signature. I actually kind of like this. There's a little bit of a vintage effect charm to it that I think will have some applications and could be useful for filmmakers looking for a specific look. And so you can see that resolution is fairly good on the plane of focus, which is quite small, and the bokeh quality is pretty decent. Here's another image that shows that off, and so again, it doesn't like pop off the page, but definitely usable amount of resolution, but a very nice bokeh quality. Here's another example here, and kind of the same truths are here. What I will point out is that fringing doesn't look too bad here. You can see a little bit of green fringing here, but I would say that fringing is not a huge problem with the lens. They've done quite a good job with that. Now, I actually quite like the sunburst effect here. We have got a 12-bladed aperture, but the sunburst is actually a really, really attractive looking one. You can see for this particular image, stop down, that the flare resistance is not too bad here. There's not too bad of a loss of contrast and no obvious ghosting effects. Wide open, however, the lens is much more prone towards flare, and you can see it taking place here. And then if we take a look at our video, you can see as it pans across, there's a huge loss of contrast, and so a veiling effect, and then also a prismatic haze and some ghosting. If we stop it down, we see that a lot of the veiling disappears, and contrast is stronger. However, there is a little bit more pronounced ghosting. So after carefully examining the optical performance, my conclusion is that the Pergear 25mm F1.8 is just barely covering the APS-C frame. And I think that this is a lens that probably, it obviously overlaps micro four thirds, which is even a smaller sensor size. But I think that it isn't quite where it's covering APS-C fully. The reason why I say that is that that little bit of lingering vignette in the very extreme corners, and the fact that when I went to crop an image from full frame, I found that I could barely get the same framing as APS-C even by cropping. And so that tells me that that image circle is for APS-C is just really barely being covered. And I think that's also why we see, even though the lens gets quite sharp across the frame, right in those extreme edges, there's always that little bit of fall off. And I think that that's probably the real cause right there. At the same time, however, if that is not a destructive principle for you, there's really a lot here that I like. Across a lot of the frame, the resolution is quite good. I think that it has a pretty nice bokeh quality for, basically for this kind of focal length. It also has a look to it that is somewhat unique. It's not incredibly high contrast, but that gives it a certain charm and a look to images that I suspect some photographers will really like. And the fact that it's so small means that it's easy to bring along, and whether you use it or you don't use it on a particular outing, you're not going to feel bad for having brought it along. I think it's also an interesting option as a filmmaker. However, I will point out that everything is pretty close together here, and so if you're looking to do any kind of gearing, or you probably don't have enough room to do standard gearing, and even if you want to add something on there, a stick to pull focus, there's not a lot of operating room. It's a really small lens. So I'm intrigued to see what Pergear is going to do in the future. I'm certainly not put off by their first effort here. I think it punches above its weight, both in its build and in its optical performance, and so that is certainly intriguing, and I always welcome more competitors into the market. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you look in the description down below, there is linkage there to an image gallery if you want to look at more photos, also some buying links if you want to purchase one for yourself. Beyond that, there is the linkage to follow me on social media, to become a patron, to sign up for my newsletter, and if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.